Hello and welcome to Democracy in the Balance, where we examine critical issues facing our republic. I'm Walter Cronkite. Today we're honored to have two very special guests, Founding Fathers Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, joining us for a hard-hitting discussion on the separation of church and state. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Walter. I'm pleased to join you in defense of a principle so dear to our hearts. We've reached a critical moment in history, and Americans must reassert the importance of keeping the church and state out of one another's business.
Indeed, the principle of religious liberty and the separation of church and state is fundamental to the nation we helped found. We're grateful for the invitation to speak on it.
Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Madison, you both were architects of America's commitment to religious freedom. In fact, President Jefferson, you famously wrote that the American people built a wall of separation between church and state. President Madison, you championed the First Amendment's guarantee that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Today, many fear that the wall of separation is cracking. We're seeing houses of worship wade directly into electioneering, public schools being pressed to teach religious doctrine, and taxpayer funds being steered toward religious schools. The question before us: are these trends a betrayal of the secular ideals upon which you founded this nation?
Walter, they absolutely are. The developments you describe strike at the heart of what James and I fought for in our time. A nation where no one is compelled in matters of religion, and where the government stays out of the pulpit and the pulpit stays out of the government. We intended, through the First Amendment and state measures like the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, to prevent exactly what we're seeing now.
I could not agree more. The separation of church and state was not an afterthought for us, it was a cornerstone. History had taught us that entangling religion with government corrupts both. Every time religion and government have been mixed, it has produced ceaseless strife and oppression. Just look at Europe's bloody religious wars that soaked the soil with blood for centuries. We sought to spare America that fate. As I once wrote, religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together.
Your stance was unmistakable. Mr. Jefferson, your Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, passed in 1786, declared that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever. And you warned it is sinful and tyrannical to force people to fund faiths they do not believe in. Those are powerful words. Given that foundation, let's delve into what's happening today. First, let's talk about politics from the pulpit. Just days ago, in a break with decades of tradition, the Internal Revenue Service announced that it will allow houses of worship to endorse candidates for public office without losing their tax-exempt status. Since 1954, the tax code, via the Johnson Amendment, has barred churches and other nonprofits from openly campaigning for or against political candidates. It was a bright line meant to keep partisan politics out of the pews. But in a surprise move, the IRS effectively said that when a pastor speaks to their congregation through its customary channels of communication on matters of faith in connection with electoral politics, it does not count as campaign intervention. In essence, the IRS likened a church's candidate endorsement to a kind of family discussion among the congregation. I'd like to hear your reactions. President Madison, as the principal author of the First Amendment, what do you make of this?
Walter, I find this development deeply troubling. The IRS's new stance punches a gaping hole in that wall of separation Mr. Jefferson spoke of. By allowing clergy to openly endorse candidates from the pulpit, all while enjoying a tax-exempt status granted by the government, the state is now effectively subsidizing partisan preaching. This is precisely the scenario the Johnson Amendment was crafted to avoid. The idea that such endorsements are merely innocent family discussions is frankly disingenuous. We wrote the First Amendment to prevent the union of political power with ecclesiastical authority because we knew it would harm the republic. And remember, when the government confers tax-exempt privileges on churches, it has every right to insist they not function as political machines. If that line vanishes, ministers become political kingmakers, and churches turn into campaign headquarters, all tax subsidized by citizens of all faiths or none. that violates the liberty of conscience of those forced to subsidize viewpoints they reject.
Mr. Madison is exactly right. In our day, we were crystal clear that the state must not favor or fund religious institutions that take partisan sides. When I hear that the IRS will now tolerate churches backing candidates, I recall the warning I penned long ago. To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. For a taxpayer who does not share a church's faith or politics, being forced to effectively bankroll that church's electioneering through its tax exemption is an affront to justice. This IRS decision is a profound risk to the republic. It invites houses of worship to become political actors while enjoying special tax advantages. Consider the implications. Religious organizations could become havens for dark money in campaigns, with donations given under the guise of tithes, influencing elections without transparency or taxation. We strove to avoid the emergence of an official state religion or the undue influence of clergy on government. Yet here we see government policy bending to give clergy a green light to influence government leadership directly.
And it doesn't just harm the political process, it harms religion too. When churches hitch themselves to political candidates, they risk degrading the spiritual mission for worldly power. In my memorial and remonstrance of 1785, I argued that religion flourishes in greater purity without the support of government. Now, if pastors become enmeshed in elections, houses of worship will be seen as just another political interest group. They'll sow division among their own flocks, ceaseless strife, to use my earlier words, and the public's trust in both religious institutions and government will erode.
To play devil's advocate, supporters of this change say it's about free speech, that pastors should be able to speak on moral issues in politics without fear of IRS reprisal. In fact, President Trump had promised to totally destroy the Johnson Amendment, to let faith leaders speak freely in politics. How do you respond to those who frame this as protecting religious free speech?
No one disputes that clergy, as individuals, have free speech. But the Johnson Amendment never muzzled pastors from speaking on issues. It merely set a condition if their church wants a tax exemption as a charitable, nonpartisan entity. The pastor could still endorse a candidate personally, or even from the pulpit. Only the church's privileged tax status was at stake. That's a fair trade-off to prevent state-subsidized politicking. If a church wants to be a campaign headquarters, fine, but it should relinquish its tax exemption and enter the fray on equal footing. Furthermore, the notion that we need to free pastors to preach politics ignores the flip side. Who will protect the people in the pews from political coercion by spiritual authorities? Many Americans attend church to worship, not to be told whom to vote for. When ministers implicitly leverage their religious authority to sway votes, it pressures congregants' consciences, a scenario we found unacceptable. The wall of separation I described was as much about keeping government out of religion as keeping religion out of government. When that wall is breached in either direction, liberty is threatened.
Let me add, allowing tax-exempt churches to engage in electioneering also cheats our democratic process. Other organizations that endorse candidates, say political action committees, are subject to campaign finance laws and disclosure. Will churches now disclose their donors who are funding political messages? Unlikely under this new guidance. This creates a shadowy channel of political influence immune from the transparency essential to an informed electorate. That is dangerous for the intelligence of the nation. A democracy cannot function if large segments of political spending or endorsement are veiled behind pulpits and collection plates.
It sounds like you both see the IRS's move as a step onto a slippery slope, one that risks both our democratic integrity and the sanctity of religion. This actually dovetails into another area of concern, the growing entanglement of religion and public education. Let's turn to that. Public education has long been a battleground for church-state issues. The latest flashpoint, Oklahoma. Earlier this year, Oklahoma's State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ryan Walters, ordered all public schools to keep a Bible in every classroom and for teachers to use it in their lessons. Every teacher, every classroom in the state will have a Bible and will be teaching from the Bible in the classroom, he decreed. This mandate was issued at a State Board of Education meeting in late June of 2024. When some educators pushed back, Walters doubled down in July, threatening to hold rogue administrators accountable if they refuse to comply. He said just because some school officials don't like it or are offended doesn't mean they won't do it. We will enforce the law, Walters warned. He insists the Bible is indispensable in understanding the development of Western civilization, essentially arguing it's a historical cornerstone that deserves a place in the curriculum. Now, local school districts in Oklahoma have largely resisted this order, pointing out that under state law, curriculum decisions are up to elected local school boards, not a state bureaucrat. Many superintendents flatly said they would not be buying Bibles for every classroom or altering their teaching to include Bible lessons. Still, the very attempt to force Bible teaching in public schools has alarmed people nationwide. Mr. Jefferson, you authored the Virginia statute that proclaimed no one should be compelled to support religious worship or teaching. What's your reaction to what's happening in Oklahoma?
Frankly, Walter, I'm appalled, though not entirely surprised. We always knew there would be those who try to smuggle sectarian doctrine into public institutions under various guises. What Oklahoma's official is doing violates the most basic premise of religious freedom. No government authority should dictate religious content in the education of our youth. To force children in public schools who come from diverse faiths and backgrounds to receive religious instruction from the Bible is exactly the kind of coercion we outlawed at the founding of this country. Think back to why I wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. In that law, we affirmed that Almighty God hath created the mind free, and that all attempts to influence it by coercion are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. We declared that civil rights have no dependence on religious opinions. No citizen should be deprived or advantaged based on what they believe. Forcing the Bible on students in a public school is a departure from these ideals. It effectively establishes one religious viewpoint as officially favored in a state institution, which is forbidden by our First Amendment.
I wholeheartedly agree. In 1785, when Patrick Henry proposed a bill in Virginia to tax citizens for the support of Christian teachers, I wrote my memorial and remonstrance against it, rallying our fellow Virginians to see the danger. We prevailed and instead enacted Mr. Jefferson's statute. What Superintendent Walters is attempting in Oklahoma is a modern echo of Patrick Henry's bill, an attempt to use public power and resources to favor particular religious teachings. Let's call it what it is, an establishment of religion in the public schools. The harm to education and to the intelligence of the nation would be profound. Public schools are meant to teach young minds how to think critically and scientifically, to expose them to a broad curriculum of facts and ideas. Imposing the Bible as a required text in history or literature classes, beyond objective study of its influence, risks crossing into proselytizing. It's one thing to study the Bible academically as literature or history of religion, which can be done constitutionally, but by Mr. Walter's own words, he envisions teaching from the Bible in a manner that sounds devotional. If state officials can force one sacred text into every classroom, what message does that send to students of different faiths or no faith? It tells them this religion has the official stamp of approval. That marginalizes every family who does not share the favored faith. It's a recipe for exactly the kind of sectarian division and suspicion we strove to prevent. Today it's the Bible and 10 Commandments in classrooms. Tomorrow it could be prayers, mandated, or science classes skewed to align with certain religious doctrines. This undermines education itself. A biology teacher might feel pressured to teach biblical creation in lieu of evolution. A history teacher might censor facts that contradict religious narratives.
We founded a secular republic not because we were hostile to religion, but because we valued true faith and true knowledge. I'm a man of faith in the sense that I believe in a creator, but I famously refuse to include a divinity school at the University of Virginia because I believe education should be kept separate from sectarian control. The mind must be free to inquire. What Oklahoma is doing is the opposite. It's an attempt to shackle young minds to one group's notion of doctrine. Let me be clear. Religion and education should come from the home and personal choice, not the state. Parents are free to teach their children scripture. Churches are free to run Sunday schools, and private religious schools exist for those who seek them. But public schools are civic institutions. They must welcome all and favor none. If a state imposes the Bible today, what if another state official tomorrow imposes another religion's text in a community where their faith dominates? Once the principle of neutrality is broken, every sect will battle to capture the schoolhouse. The end result will be chaos and a deeply fractured nation. We founded a secular republic not because we were hostile to religion, but because we valued true faith and true knowledge. I'm a man of faith in the sense that I believe in a creator, but I famously refuse to include a divinity school at the University of Virginia because I believe education should be kept separate from sectarian control. The mind must be free to inquire. What Oklahoma is doing is the opposite. It's an attempt to shackle young minds to one group's notion of doctrine. Let me be clear. Religion and education should come from the home and personal choice, not the state. Parents are free to teach their children scripture. Churches are free to run Sunday schools, and private religious schools exist for those who seek them. But public schools are civic institutions. They must welcome all and favor none. If a state imposes the Bible today, what if another state official tomorrow imposes another religion's text in a community where their faith dominates? Once the principle of neutrality is broken, every sect will battle to capture the schoolhouse. The end result will be chaos and a deeply fractured nation.
It strikes me that what you're describing is not just a local Oklahoma issue, but part of a broader pattern. Oklahoma's Bible mandate is one piece. The same Superintendent, Walters, has also pushed for displaying the Ten Commandments, and even has ties to an effort to establish a publicly funded religious charter school in the state. Other states have seen similar pushes, like proposals in Texas to post the Ten Commandments in every classroom, for instance. We're seeing a resurgence of efforts to insert religious symbols and teachings into the public square under official auspices.
And all of it comes from a misunderstanding or an outright repudiation of our founding intent. Some modern politicians argue that America is a Christian nation and thus should enshrine biblical teachings in law and schools, but we explicitly rejected establishing any national religion. The Constitution never mentions Christianity, God, or the Bible, and that was by design. We wanted people of all faiths and none to feel equal in the eyes of the law. Today's attempts to privilege one faith in public institutions fundamentally betray that promise. It is heartening that many Oklahoma educators stood up and said no to Walter's order. They noted rightly that he had no legal authority to dictate their curriculum with religious content. This resistance shows that the American instinct for religious freedom is still alive. But the fact that a high-ranking official even tried this is a red flag. It tells us that vigilance is needed. Jefferson once warned that any act narrowing the separation of church and state would be an infringement of natural right. We're witnessing attempted infringements, and we must raise the alarm.
If I may add one more point, Walters claimed the Bible is essential to understanding Western civilization. Well, certainly the Bible has influenced history and culture, but public schools can teach about that influence objectively without preaching the text as truth. There's a vast difference between teaching about religion, which is permissible, and teaching religion as doctrine, which is not. It appears Oklahoma's mandate crossed that line, and I fear such moves, if successful, will diminish the quality of public education. Schools would spend precious class time on sectarian instruction at the expense of inclusive curricula in science, civics, arts, and real history. In short, entangling church with state education threatens both the intellect of our youth and the unity of our nation. An educated nation, one that encourages critical thinking and respects diversity, is a safer, stronger republic. Conversely, a nation that lets religious zealotry dictate public education will find itself intellectually stagnant and endlessly at war with itself over whose faith gets to rule the schoolroom.
The issues don't stop at classrooms. We also need to discuss the push to direct public funding to religious schools, which you both have already touched on. Let's stay in Oklahoma for a moment, since it's a microcosm of these battles. Last year, an application was approved by the Oklahoma statewide virtual charter school board for St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual School, which would have been the nation's first ever publicly funded religious charter school. In other words, a school run by a Catholic archdiocese, teaching religious doctrine, but funded by taxpayer dollars as a charter school. That approval set off a firestorm. The Oklahoma Attorney General sued to block it, arguing that since charter schools are public schools, giving one to a church would violate both state law and the First Amendment by directing public funds to a sectarian institution. The Oklahoma Supreme Court agreed. By a 7-1 vote, they held that a taxpayer-funded religious school would indeed violate the separation of church and state. But then, the operators of the charter and their allies appealed, and the case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court this year. The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments on April 30, 2025, about whether to let that religious charter school open. Reports indicate the justices were divided, and in fact, the court ended up deadlocking 4-4, with one justice recused, meaning the lower court's ban on the school stands, for now. However, advocates for religious funding are not backing down. They cite recent Supreme Court precedents that have steadily chipped away at barriers, such as a ruling that Maine could not exclude religious schools from a state tuition voucher program. We're seeing a broader trend. Vouchers, or education savings accounts in many states, allow public education funds to flow to private schools, the majority of which are religious. Proponents say public funds should follow the student to the school of their choice, even if it's a church school, claiming anything less is religious discrimination. Opponents, like Americans United for Separation of Church and State, argue that forcing taxpayers to pay for religious education is a fundamental violation of liberty. They often quote you, Mr. Jefferson, that it is sinful and tyrannical to require a man to fund teachings he does not believe in. Given that you actually wrote those words, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Should public funds ever support religious schooling?
Walter, my answer in 1786 is the same as it would be today. No, public funds should be used for public purposes, and those purposes in education must be secular and inclusive. When I said compelling a person to fund someone else's religion is sinful and tyrannical, that was not hyperbole. It violates one's deepest freedom of conscience. Think about the parent of one faith, or no faith, paying taxes that are then diverted to propagate an entirely different faith's doctrines to children. It's coercion of the purse, which is akin to coercion of the spirit. In our Virginia Statutes preamble, I listed this grievance plainly. To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. That line is directly on point for funding religious schools. If the state of Oklahoma, or any state, took tax dollars from all citizens and gave them to a Catholic, or Protestant, or Jewish, or Muslim school to teach his creed, the state would be forcing every taxpayer to support that creed. This we absolutely prohibited at the founding of Virginia's government, and the First Amendment extended that principle to the nation.
Mr. Jefferson is exactly right, and I'll add, our Constitution's Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, was designed to prevent government from funding or endorsing religion. Using public money to run sectarian schools is the very definition of establishing religion. It blurs the line between church and state in the worst way. It doesn't matter if it's done indirectly via vouchers or directly via charter funding. The effect is the same. The government is in the religion business, picking up the tab for religious teaching. I find the arguments by the proponents of such funding specious. They say excluding religious schools from funding is discrimination against religion. On the contrary, we excluded religious institutions from public funding to protect everyone's religious freedom. In one of the recent cases, the Supreme Court said if a state offers a benefit, like a scholarship, it can't bar religious schools from it. That flips our original intent on its head. We intended not mandatory inclusion of religion in public benefits, but mandatory exclusion of state involvement in religion. Look at the logical consequence. If every public benefit must be extended to religious organizations on equal terms, soon you'll have churches demanding taxpayer funds for their sanctuaries' upkeep, or religious charities insisting on government grants while proselytizing. This obliterates the line we drew. The freedom these groups seek is actually a license to dip into the public treasury at the cost of everybody else's freedom of conscience.
Consider also what this does to religion itself. A core reason I oppose state churches is that state support corrupts religion. When you bribe churches with public money, as I phrase it, you risk religious groups tailoring their doctrine to please politicians for funding. Faith should be supported by the voluntary conviction of believers, not government largesse. If a religious school cannot attract enough voluntary tuition or church subsidy to operate, that is a sign it lacks sufficient support, and it is not the business of government to prop it up. When government begins funding religious schools, it will inevitably want to regulate them too, since it's the public's money. How long before doctrinal disputes become political disputes because public dollars are involved?
A very real risk. Imagine the contentiousness, taxpayers and lawmakers arguing over which religion's schools get funded, whether the teachings meet standards, possibly demanding oversight into how theology is taught since public money is at stake. It's an invitation for government to meddle in doctrine, which is dangerous for religious autonomy, and for religious groups to meddle in politics to protect or expand their share of funding, dangerous for the Republic. We foresaw this. That's why I wrote in 1822 that every example of separation of church and state is important to show that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together.
Some proponents of funding religious schools argue that parents have the right to a religious education for their children, and that if the state provides an education benefit, it shouldn't exclude them. How would you address the parental rights or school choice argument?
Parents absolutely have the right to provide a religious education to their own children, but not the right to demand that others pay for it. Freedom of religion means you may practice your faith, but it also means I am free not to subsidize your practice. In practical terms, any parent who desires a religious education for their child can enroll them in a private religious school or homeschool them with religious curriculum. That's their prerogative. What they do not have in a free society is the prerogative to reach into the public coffers, filled by their neighbors' tax payments, to fund their private religious choice. Public schools were established as a great equalizer, a common ground where all, regardless of creed, could obtain an education in secular subjects, unified as Americans. If that system is lacking, by all means reform and invest in it, but do not siphon funds to create parallel sectarian systems. Doing so not only violates conscience, it also risks fragmenting the nation's educational foundations along religious lines. You end up with de facto religious segregation in schooling, Protestant kids in one set of schools, Catholic kids in another, Jewish or Muslim or secular kids, each in their own silos. That erodes the social cohesion that public education is meant to build.
Well said. I would also remind people that nobody is suggesting religious schools be outlawed, or that religious parents can't educate their children as they see fit. This is solely about who pays for it. If your faith is important to you, investing your own resources in your faith school is part of that commitment. Expecting the state to foot the bill is a slippery step toward an established church. And if the state starts deciding which religious schools qualify for funding, you're essentially licensing certain religions. Again, anathema to our Constitution.
It sounds like, to both of you, public funding of religious schools poses grave risks to individual liberty of conscience, to the purity of both government and religion, and to social unity. We've now discussed churches in politics, religion in public schools, and public money for religious schools, all areas where the church-state line is being blurred. Let's zoom out as we near conclusion. Given everything we've explored, I want to explicitly address the dangers, the risks to the Republic, to education, and to what our questioner called the intelligence of the nation. Why do these breaches of church-state separation threaten America's future?
Walter, the risks are profound. First, to the Republic itself. A government even slightly entangled with religion inevitably plays favorites. That erodes the legitimacy of the government in the eyes of those outside the favored faith. It creates factionalism along religious lines, the very jealousies and animosities among sects that we hope to prevent. History shows that when religious factions capture state power, oppression of minorities follows. If churches become political kingmakers, as with the IRS decision, or if states endorse one religion's teachings, as in Oklahoma's schools, citizens who don't adhere to that religion will feel correctly that they are less than full citizens. The social contract phrase, Moreover, introducing sectarian strife into politics can paralyze our capacity to solve national problems. Instead of debating policies on their merits, legislators may start invoking sectarian justifications, turning every policy debate into a holy war. That could gridlock our democracy or tilt it toward theocracy. We must remember our republic was not designed as a theocracy. It was founded on the Enlightenment principles of reason, debate, and the consent of the governed, not the will of an established clergy.
As for education, the risk is that we undermine the quality and unity of public instruction. Public education has been a pillar of American enlightenment, a wellspring of the nation's intelligence and innovation. If we allow it to be commandeered by religious agendas, we'll see science suppressed or distorted. Think of subjects like biology, geology, astronomy. All could conflict with literalist readings of Scripture. Students might grow up scientifically illiterate or historically misinformed, all because their curriculum was bent to fit religious dogma. That would be a tragic regression. It would make our population more susceptible to superstition, less able to compete in a modern, knowledge-driven world, and less tolerant of differing viewpoints. And let's be frank, a populace taught to accept claims on faith rather than evidence is easier to manipulate. The intelligence of the nation, by which I take to mean our collective intellectual rigor and critical thinking, will decline if sectarian doctrine replaces fact-based education. In the long run, that weakens everything: our economy, fewer skilled scientists and thinkers, our public discourse, more prone to extremist rhetoric, and less to reasoned debate, and even our national security. Imagine if divisions between religious communities deepen to the point of internal conflict.
I'll add that diminishing the wall of separation also threatens religion spiritually. It may seem counterintuitive, but when religion grabs for temporal power, influence over laws, schools, public funds, it often loses moral authority. People, especially the young, could grow cynical seeing faith used as a political tool. Genuine spirituality can be tainted by the compromises and corruption that come with political entanglement. Thus, not only is the Republic's civic health at risk, but the integrity of religion in society is as well.
All these points boil down to this: the separation of church and state is not anti-religion. It is profoundly pro-liberty and pro-progress. It protects the Republic by preventing tyranny of any one faith. It protects education and national intelligence by ensuring schools are places of free inquiry and common civic knowledge. And it even protects religion by keeping it from depending on government or wielding coercive power.
Powerful words. Before we wrap up, I want to ask each of you, given the current challenges, what advice or warning would you offer to Americans today?
I would remind my fellow Americans that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, especially liberty of conscience. Do not take the separation of church and state for granted. When you see it violated, raise your voice, use your laws and courts to strike down those violations. I'd also say, recall the founding generation's lessons. We had fresh memories of what happens when church and state unite: persecution, stagnation, ignorance. We wanted America to avoid those traps. If I may be so bold, I'll quote myself once more. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. In 1800, I wrote that in the context of resisting clergy who sought political influence. Tyranny over the mind is exactly what happens when government dictates religious truth or when religious authority captures government power. To my countrymen, I say, rekindle that spirit of resistance to any tyranny over thought, whether it comes under the guise of piety or patriotism. Reject it if it encroaches on freedom of mind.
And I would urge Americans to remember that the Constitution's Bill of Rights begins with a guarantee that government must stay neutral in matters of faith. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Live up to that principle in all spheres, in your laws, in your public schools, in your public expenditures. Don't be lulled by those who claim mixing religion and state is harmless or beneficial. Demand evidence and question motives. Often those pushing hardest for church-state fusion seek power, not piety. In practical terms, support organizations and leaders who defend church-state separation. Vote against measures that erode it. If you are a person of faith, consider that your religion likely flourishes best when it isn't entangled with government favors. If you are not religious, remember that the religious freedom of your neighbors is tied to your own freedom of thought. We're all in this together.
Gentlemen, this has been an illuminating discussion. To summarize, Jefferson and Madison are sounding the alarm that recent moves, from allowing political endorsements in churches, to mandating Bibles in classrooms, to diverting public funds to religious schools, represent a clear violation of the nation you envision. The risks range from corruption of our political process to deterioration of our educational standards and civic unity. In your era, you built a wall to safeguard our democracy's future. In ours, it seems we must repair and reinforce that wall. Thank you, President Jefferson and President Madison, for lending us your insight and your passion on this critical issue.
Thank you, Walter. Please continue to bring Americans the news and facts they desperately need.
It's been a pleasure, and may Americans never forget, the blessings of liberty include the freedom to worship, or not, as one chooses, and that is only secure so long as no sect can enlist the government on its side.
Wise words. And that's the way it is for today's Democracy in the Balance. I'm Walter Cronkite. Thanks for listening, and stay vigilant out there.